asking more questions. Our next speaker is Mr. Ben Rogers. He does not need much introduction. And as we all know, he's been long-time supporter and friend of this organization. And he's a co-founder and the chief executive of Hong Kong Watch. He's been work as an international human rights activist for many, many years. So with that, please go ahead, Ben, with your lecture.
Well, thank you very much. It's a really great privilege and pleasure to be with you. Like all of us, of course, I would have hoped we could have been together in person, but thanks to the pandemic, we're not able to. But thanks to modern technology, we're able to connect in this way, and it's a privilege to be with you. I've been well aware of this very important conference for many years, and I've never had the chance to participate in previous conferences, so I'm really glad to have this opportunity now. I was asked to focus my remarks on the relationship between the United Kingdom, Hong Kong, and China, and I was asked to come up with a title for this, and I gave it the title Britain, Hong Kong, and China: Broken Promises, Treaty Violations, Wolf Warrior Diplomacy, and Mass Atrocities, Time for a Reset. There are, of course, various other elements that I could have put into that title, but it would have made it even longer than it is. Just some very brief background for those of you who might not be familiar with my own personal relationship with China. I first went to China when I was 18 years old to teach English in the city of Qingdao for 6 months in my year between school and university. So I've been in and around China for more than for almost 3 decades. And I lived in Hong Kong for the first 5 years after the handover of Hong Kong. I've traveled around China, both because of my interest in China, but also my work on North Korea and Myanmar, which took me many times to the North Korea border and the Myanmar border. And then, as you kindly said in your introduction, I co-founded Hong Kong Watch 3 years ago because basically at the time of the umbrella movement in 2014, I realized the situation in Hong Kong was taking a dramatic turn in the wrong direction. And so I started to engage in a personal individual capacity in advocating and speaking out for Hong Kong. I then realized that there was a need really to have an organization to provide a platform for that advocacy. And my connection with Hong Kong, I guess, deepened even further in October 2017, 3 years ago, when I was denied entry to Hong Kong on the orders of Beijing, becoming, I think, the first foreigner, or certainly the first Westerner, to be denied entry to Hong Kong. Of course, since my case, there've been a long line of others who've had the same experience, including the executive director of Human Rights Watch, the Asia news editor of the Financial Times, and a number of others. I should also say 2 other things by way of introduction. You'll notice that I have Winnie the Pooh on my shelf behind me. I was given Winnie the Pooh in Taiwan last year. And I have him there not because I'm particularly a fan of cuddly toys, but because Winnie the Pooh, of course, was banned from China in 2017, just a few months, I think, before I was. And so I feel a particular affinity and solidarity with him there. It's also worth mentioning in this whole, as I talk about the way the British Hong Kong-China relationship has developed, some of my other affiliations that are just relevant to this. I'm on the advisory group to the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China, IPAC, and I'm very glad to see Professor Kotler here, because I believe he's the co-chair of IPAC in Canada. I'm also the Deputy Chair of the Conservative Party Human Rights Commission, which has published one major report on China and is about to publish another. And I've worked for many years for the human rights organization CSW, which focuses on freedom of religion or belief. And I think as we look at the UK-China relationship and the change in that, the issue of freedom of religion or belief has featured in that dynamic as much as the Hong Kong situation has. And I'll come back to that in just a few moments. I've also been very involved in the issue of organ harvesting, and the British barrister Sir Geoffrey Nice, QC, chaired the China Tribunal last year, which I had some involvement in helping to initiate, and he's about to chair another tribunal on the issue of the Uyghurs. Let me, as I look at this question of UK, Hong Kong, China relations, let me take a step back to 4 years ago, when the Conservative Party Human Rights Commission carried out its first inquiry on human rights in China and published a report which we titled The Darkest Moment. And actually, that title came from the testimony provided to our inquiry by Dr. Yang Jan Li, who used the expression at that time that it was the darkest moment for human rights in China since the Tiananmen massacre. And at that time, we were just at the tail end of David Cameron's government. And of course, David Cameron and the Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne, had pioneered what they called the golden era of Sino-British relations. Of course, their policy was not a totally new policy. It was an expansion and extension of the policy of most of their immediate predecessors. Tony Blair and Gordon Brown certainly pursued very positive relations with China, but David Cameron and George Osborne took things to a whole new level. And one of the turning points for me personally, in terms of my increased activism on China, was when Xi Jinping made his state visit to the UK in 2015. And I was so shocked by how the British government at that time rolled out the red carpet for him without saying anything publicly on the human rights situation in China. And it took one member of parliament who I work with very closely to raise an urgent question in the House of Commons on a specific human rights case in the middle of the state visit. By tabling that question, that forced the government to say something on human rights publicly in the middle of Xi's state visit, but they were very angry about it. Our own government was very angry about it. And so when we published in 2016 this report, we were definitely not the number 10 Downing Street's favorite people. In fact, they were pretty annoyed with us. And I refer to that because 4 years on, it's really remarkable how much has changed in the UK's approach to China. There's still a lot more that I think needs to be done. But when I think now, this year, the Conservative Party Human Rights Commission is carrying out a new inquiry and will be coming out with a new report very soon, the context in which we're operating is entirely different. Many members of parliament within the Conservative Party, but also in all parties in the UK, are now waking up and speaking out on China, and criticizing the Chinese Communist Party regime has moved from being a very marginal activity that was regarded by many in government as a real nuisance to now being a very mainstream position to varying degrees. The position of government is obviously somewhat more moderate than that of many backbenchers, but nevertheless there is a growing number of parliamentarians who are speaking out. And I think there are several factors behind that, and it's happened in a very short space of time. I think the COVID-19 pandemic and the CCP's handling of it in the very early stages, particularly the silencing of whistleblowers and the cover-up and the failure to alert the world in a timely manner definitely had a big impact on thinking in the British government and the British Parliament. Around the same time, we had the debate about Huawei, and very rapidly opinion moved within Parliament and as a result of that within government on Huawei, and the government was forced really to do a U-turn on its position on Huawei. I think the news that has come out increasingly and shockingly about the situation of the Uyghurs has had a big impact, and the Uyghur situation has moved again from being an issue that was relatively unknown and rather a marginal topic to now receiving huge amounts of attention in Parliament and increasingly parliamentarians and other experts describing it as a genocide. I think the wolf warrior diplomacy has also been counterproductive. The Chinese ambassador in the UK, Liu Xiaoming, like many of his counterparts, has taken this very aggressive approach, which has not endeared him to British policymakers. And then, of course, lastly, the situation in Hong Kong. I think that the British government came to stand up for Hong Kong very late in the day, and I was previously very critical of the British government in past years for failing to stand up for Hong Kong's freedoms. But at the end of the day, after the imposition of the national security law on Hong Kong, the British government, to its credit, moved from taking this very mild position to a much more robust position very quickly. And it did that in particular, both with its very strong statements, but also with its extension and its very generous and courageous offer to Hong Kong British national overseas status holders at the risk of Beijing's wrath. It also, of course, suspended its extradition agreement with Hong Kong and extended its arms embargo, which already existed on China, to Hong Kong. And earlier this summer, the British Parliament passed our Magnitsky sanctions legislation. And there are growing calls for the UK to apply our Magnitsky sanctions to Hong Kong government officials and Beijing officials in the same way the US has done. I think we may be a little way off that happening just yet, but where I think we're very close to is seeing the British government apply Magnitsky sanctions in relation to the situation of the Uyghurs. And the last thing I would say about how the change in the British government's position is that it has now recognized 3 violations of the Sino-British Joint Declaration, 2 of which occurred this year. The imposition of the national security law, and then just last week, the disqualification of pro-democracy legislators in the Legislative Council. I would argue there have been many more violations of the Joint Declaration, but the fact that the British government has officially said there have been 3 violations of that international treaty, I think is very significant and gives us something to build on in terms of urging the UK to go even further. And so let me conclude my remarks and to allow some time for questions, hopefully, just by saying, what would I like the UK to do next? Well, apart from implementing targeted Magnitsky sanctions, I would like to see the UK lead the free world in forming a much stronger and well-coordinated coalition of like-minded countries to respond to all of the human rights and security challenges that the CCP represents. It could do that in a number of ways. I've advocated proposing the creation of an international contact group, particularly to coordinate the global response to the situation in Hong Kong. we could strengthen an alliance of democracies. I know that Boris Johnson has talked about the formation of a D10 group of democracies. I know that President-elect Biden, assuming he does take office, if the legal challenges in the US aren't successful, my understanding is that he may well have an interest in a global summit of democracies and in pursuing a more multilateral approach. International coordination could focus, at least in part, in a lifeboat rescue package for Hong Kongers who need to flee the city. The UK, under its BNO offer, is taking a large number of people from Hong Kong, but there are many young Hong Kongers who are not eligible for the BNO program, many of whom are in the most vulnerable situations because they were frontline protesters and they're born after 1997. So like-minded countries could coordinate an effort to ensure that those who need a place of sanctuary can find one in the free world. And lastly, I think there are things that Britain and allies could do at the United Nations. The United Nations, of course, is an extremely flawed institution, but nevertheless, there are mechanisms that could be used. There's already been a call by 50 UN special rapporteurs for the creation of a UN special rapporteur on China. I and others have been calling for some kind of special mechanism specifically on Hong Kong, but I think the UK could play a key role in that. And lastly, I think with everyone else, the UK should be looking to diversify its supply chains and to move away from this focus on China, and particularly strategic dependence on China, and diversify our trading relationships and our supply chains around the world. So with that, I will stop, but I simply end by saying I think the UK is in a very different position from the one it was in even a year ago. There's a lot more to do, but I think people are finally waking up here as they are in other parts of the world as well. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you, Ben. We have a few questions from audience. The first one is, what do you think of a recent proposal in the parliament spearheaded by Sir Smith to allow case of genocide to be brought to UK courts?
I think it's an excellent proposal. One of the other people pushing it in the House of Lords is Lord Alton. And I think that it's a very important proposal because one of the key response that the British government always makes on questions of genocide is that it can't make a determination. Genocide has to be determined by international bodies, but then international bodies are so hamstrung by China's influence that they're unlikely to either. And so I think giving the power to our courts to make a legal judgment, not a political judgment, but a legal judgment as to whether something amounts to genocide is a very good idea. My concern is whether the British government will support the legislation, and that it probably won't, but there may be enough backbench members of parliament that may support it and force the government to do it. But if it can be implemented, I strongly support it.
Great. The second question is, what sanction do you think the UK is currently considering taking against China for breaching the Hong Kong Treaty by imposing the new rules, the national security, that kind of stuff? Specifically how the sanction is as a response to this breach?
Well, certainly I and others have been advocating that the British government should implement some sanctions. One of the challenges with the Sino-British Joint Declaration, and I and my colleagues have consulted a number of lawyers on this, because we wondered whether a case could be brought to the International Court of Justice, for example, for these violations. A lot of legal experts tell us that, unfortunately, the Sino-British Joint Declaration, even though it is an international treaty, doesn't have an enforcement mechanism to it. So it's actually a very weak treaty in terms of enforcement. and so the legal advice is that a case probably couldn't be brought on that. We are looking into, with other experts, the possibility of whether a case could be brought, not directly for violations of the Joint Declaration, but for violations of the Vienna Convention on upholding international conventions, because then there's a whole range of treaties that China has signed that a case could be brought on. We're still looking into that, and we'll have a job to persuade the UK to do it. But that may be one option. And then, of course, there is the Magnitsky sanctions. Unfortunately, the threshold in our Magnitsky sanctions legislation is quite high, and there are some who argue that what's happened in Hong Kong may not fit the criteria. On the other hand, Bill Browder, the pioneer of Magnitsky sanctions, has said to me very clearly he definitely does think that what's happened in Hong Kong meets the criteria. So we're trying to persuade the government. We'll carry on pushing the government on this. It may well be that they take the view that they should sanction those responsible for what's happened to the Uyghurs first, and that would be understandable, because of course what's happened to the Uyghurs is even more egregious. So if they start with that, and then we could push them to sanction those involved in the violations in Hong Kong, that may be the path forward.
Thank you so much for your excellent presentation, Ben. With that, we're ending our first 4 lectures this morning, and Dr. Yang will moderate the next few lectures. Thank you, Ben, again.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
I'm sorry, I didn't unmute. And thanks to the previous